Hi everyone, my name is Dr. MT Vallarta. I am currently an assistant professor of ethnic studies at California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. My research interests are in queer studies, disability justice, and creative writing, in addition to being a scholar of Asian American studies and Filipinx studies. I am also a poet. In December 2023, I published my first full-length poetry collection titled What You Refuse to Remember with Harbor Editions. And right now, I am currently working on my first research monograph titled Dismantle Me, Queer, Mad, and Anti-Imperialist Filipinx Poetry. I also identify as queer and non-binary and disabled, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. Okay, so I was first introduced to the term queer and the field of queer studies when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. So I double majored in English and Asian American studies, and I came across literary and scholarly works that were theorizing the word queer beyond just an identitarian term. In particular, I was inspired and examining the work of Judith Butler and Audre Lorde and how they were approaching queerness, not as in identity, but queerness as in politics, meaning that to be queer or non-normative, it did not just include identifying as LGBTQ plus, but also being resistant to the normative state violences that have led to the racialization of Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and also the conquest and colonization of people across the global South. So to be queer also means to be anti-racist, to be anti-imperialist, to be abolitionist, to be pro-disability, migrant, and racial and trans justice. The term queer can encompass all the ways we refuse to be disciplined and punished by normative violences. I learned what normativity was through an essay by Audre Lorde called Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference. In that essay, Audre Lorde talks about this concept known as the mythical norm, where she describes that America, as well as colonial enterprises, are organized around the needs and principles of what it means to be a normal subject or citizen. And oftentimes that citizen is someone who is white, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christian, upper to middle class, or financially secure, as Lord calls it. And she talks about how people across history, across time, space, and place who have been unable to conform or fit into the mythical norm have been deemed as deviant, aberrant, or quote unquote queer. So a lot of my work is inspired by, a lot of my work is dedicated to deconstructing normativity, whether it comes in the form of heteronormativity or heteropatriarchy, and thinking about and looking at the ways that people of color, queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks, and mad folks have engaged with the word queer through art, through creative writing, and have been giving us other ways to organize and think about the world and come up with new ways to be with each other modes of social organization that are not defined by normativity. Specifically, I look at the works of Filipinx poets who don't necessarily identify as queer, but who have been queered under normative violence. So the archive that I'm working with right now includes contemporary Filipinx poets like Jose Garcia Villa, Mark Agujar, Kay Ulanday Barrett, Angela Peña Redondo, Kimberly Alidio. These are some of the poets that I examine in my first research monograph. And I look at how these contemporary Filipinx poets have been theorizing and expanding the word queer beyond popular renditions of LGBTQIA plus pride, and are situating queerness as anti-imperialism and anti-racism. I'm also looking at primary resources from the Chair of Transgender Studies archive from the University of Victoria. I made a trip out there back in 2019 where I examined queer and trans print cultures from the 90s and early 2000s. And I was looking for material that was also theorizing and approaching the word trans or transgender, again, beyond as an identity marker, but as a refusal to subscribe to the gender binary and also the normative colonial violences. So I'm working on synthesizing those materials right now in conjunction with more archival research from the Asian American Studies collection from UC Berkeley and from the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. And I'm looking at newspapers, newsletters, literary magazines, and other grassroots publications that were circulated during the late 1960s and early 70s, a period that was known as the Third World Liberation Front and also the Asian American movement. And I'm also examining how poetry and other types of creative writing that were published in these primary resources, such as the newspapers Gidra and Kalayaan International, were already using the word queer as an anti-imperialist framework. So the next keyword I'm going to talk about is poetry. Like I mentioned in my introduction, I am also a poet. I am a multi-genre writer as well, and I'm going to talk more about that with my third keyword. But I also want to share that I think there are a lot of expansive conversations going around right now about poetry in the academy and also in the field of creative writing, where folks are approaching poetry beyond just extracting meaning from the page, but also focusing on what a poem is aggravating or inciting beyond the meaning that it is trying to communicate. So I understand that as affect, again, a type of thinking, feeling, or action that a poem is trying to inspire or invoke within us. And that idea of poetry as a source of affect has been extrapolated by scholar Robin D.G. Kelley in the introduction to his book, Freedom Dreams. He talks about how poetry is actually an inexhaustible source of freedom dreams, that poetry can contain the blueprint, the desire, the the need to materialize and imagine other worlds. So in the introduction, he argues that the potentiality of poetry doesn't just lie in the meaning or message of the poem. And I'm going to quote directly from Kelly here. Poetry, therefore, is not what we simply recognize as the formal poem, but a revolt, a scream in the night, an emancipation of language and old ways of thinking. And I've been going back to this Robin Kelley quote a lot because, part of my work is thinking about how folks who are disabled, who are not able-bodied or able-minded, how they find creative, alternative, and other ways to resist and exist outside of normativity. And through my research, I've identified poetry, art, and other forms of art and creative writing as a um, incendiary source where people do not only give voice to their freedom dreams, but also give it texture. And the texture in the poetic language is what allows readers, people who are experiencing the poem, to feel those revolutionary feelings. We are invited to join in the revolt, in this emancipation of language and old ways of thinking when we read or experience a poem. And whenever I teach poetry, I like to tell my students that it's okay if you don't understand what's happening in a poem. It's okay if you're confused. Let's sit down and talk about that confusion together. Like, what about the language is so confusing? What questions do you have for this text? How is this poem making you feel? Like, let's look at the language, these specific words and sentences, the syntax. What types of feelings or actions do you associate with this language? And I found in my classes so far that framing poetry in that way as a source of affect, as something that inspires feeling or action, has been a wonderful way to introduce students to poetry and to also help them, write their own poems. I always ask them to think about, well, what do you think this poem is doing? What is it compelling or asking us to do? Um, what type of thinking or questioning is it sparking or enlightening within you? So I like to think that poetry can be a wonderful entrance to anti-imperialist thinking, and it can also serve as a way to envision and materialize revolution. in addition to affect, another thing that makes poetry very fruitful to me is form. So the rhetorical devices, the techniques that a poet employs in order to make the language come alive on the screen or on the page. And not only are there lots of forms to choose from, but as a poet, you can also be completely formless and decide not to subscribe or emulate any type of form at all. There have also been poets and writers who have invented or totally changed and expanded current forms that we have right now. An example, again, is Jose Garcia Villa. He was an incredibly avant-garde and experimental Filipinx poet. He was mostly active in the early 20th century, and he was also known as the father of Philippine Anglophone literature and of modernist Filipino poetry. One of the forms that he invented are his infamous comma poems, where a comma follows every single word in a single poem. So, for example, if you have a line that reads, "The eagle flies," there would be a comma after the eagle flies. And those poems are very challenging to read out loud because of the multiple pauses that the comma asks you to consider. And when I first encountered that form in undergrad, I was like, what is this guy doing? This is so confusing. Like, why bother writing like this? And it wasn't until years of grad school when I decided to take another look at Villa's work when I realized that he was actually giving us the opportunity to sit and reflect on our relationship with language, our relationship with each and every word, and how every single piece of diction or syntax that you decide to put in a poem has the power to elevate the language and make the reader feel and evoke action in ways that they weren't even expecting to. So I like to think of his comma poems as an opportunity to slow down, pause, and really think about what the language is doing, how within us. So I still find those poems really challenging to read, but I still find it a useful exercise to just sit down and think about what it means to write in a way where you are contained under a form and how that containment itself can actually inspire you to think outside the box. So the third keyword I'm going to be discussing is hybrid. So in Asian American studies, most folks encounter the word hybrid or hybridity in Lisa Lowe's work, Immigrant Acts, where she talks about the hybridity of Asian American identity and Asian American culture. In my work, I approach hybridity as multiplicity, multi-genre writing, and also being able to produce written works that engage with creativity and critical theory together. And to me, poetry is a hybrid genre because the poetic itself doesn't just function as an art form, but it is also a form of knowledge production, a way to communicate other types of knowing that can't be encapsulated in scholarly or theoretical writing. And like I mentioned earlier, poetry also functions as a world-making practice. It provides the blueprint to imagine and materialize other worlds. And in many ways, Filipinx culture, Filipinx literature in and of itself, as Lisa Lowe discusses in Immigrant Acts, is incredibly hybrid. We don't only have the history of Spanish colonialism informing our subjectivities, but also the history of US colonialism, Japanese colonialism, and modern US neocolonialism today that affects the experiences and the historical and contemporary landscape of Filipinxness or Filipinx studies overall. So I think poetry is a very useful avenue, a very useful method to reflect and approach that hybridity in a hybrid form as well. So, in addition to writing poetry, I also write creative nonfiction, and I use hybrid elements in my current research monograph, where I am including poems and creative vignettes between the more research heavy and theoretical heavy chapters in order to show how the very poems that I write, how the creative work that I am producing is also in conversation with the research and the scholarly work that I am also a loop that I'm also extrapolating as well. And it is very challenging to write in a hybrid fashion because my brain is going in multiple directions, and I'm also working with different genres and different types of texts. But it's also a very fruitful process because I find myself close reading and thinking about literature in ways that I would not have thought of before if I was writing a more traditional monograph. So I'm really excited to see the other ways, the other ways different poets and scholars and other writers and artists have been engaging with hybridity as well. Yeah. So a specific subject that for me requires a lot of hybridity, a lot of hybrid attentions is, intergenerational trauma. So because I am working with a body of literature written by Filipinx folks who are queer, mad, trans, and disabled, the subject of intergenerational trauma emerges in a lot of their work. And as a trauma survivor myself, it can be very difficult to engage with these works and to even write about them because so much of the content is um, triggering, very, very personal, and oftentimes there there are things that are better left unsaid or better left under or unanalyzed in order to pay respect to the work and to give it justice. So I found that writing in a hybrid fashion, approaching you know, deconstructive or analytical writing in a way where yes, you are trying to come across with a main argument, a main objective, or a main point. But as in poetry, it's also okay to trust the reader and let the reader do the work, and to also let the language, speak for itself. And a wonderful example of a of another poet scholar, or a creative writer slash scholar, who takes on a hybrid approach with their research is Grace Cho, particularly her work, Haunting the Korean Diaspora. It is a research monograph, but there are also creative vignettes interspersed throughout the book that give space, that shed light or even darkness on hers and her family's struggles with intergenerational trauma um, during colonization in Korea, and also during the Korean War. And because, as I mentioned, intergenerational trauma is a really difficult topic to talk about and analyze and engage with, I found that hybrid writing gives me the flexibility and the creativity to engage with these difficult topics, that allow us to not only understand where this trauma comes from and why it's important to talk about it, but to also think about how these traumas themselves are rooted and linked to larger systemic violences like colonialism, racism, heteropatriarchy. So I find that juxtaposing the creative writing with the more scholarly theoretical writing allows those connections to be illuminated further. Some of the poets, writers, and scholars who have really inspired my way of thinking and my praxis as a poet and scholar include Sony Coronez Bolton, his recently published book, Crypt Colony, theorizes the term compulsory able-mindedness, how able-mindedness, or not being a crazy, mad, or feeble-minded subject, was actually essential to the US colonial project in the Philippines. And Crypt Colony has really inspired the ways I am thinking about madness and the role that Filipinx poetry plays in not only re-articulating madness, but harnessing madness as that creative and agential energy. And with that, I'm also greatly inspired by the work of Lamar Jarrell Bruce, a Black Studies scholar who wrote How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind. And I am just in love with the way that Lamar Jarrell Bruce is asking us to think about madness beyond its pathologized Western psychological frame, but again, as this revolt, this incendiary energy that allows us to free ourselves from compulsory able-mindedness and other normative ways of thinking. And I also want to give a shout out to the hybrid poets out there, my dear friend Muriel Leong, my other dear friends, Angela Peña-Redondo, um, and also Victoria Chang. These are Asian American poets and writers who um, don't just write poetry, but also produce creative nonfiction, multimedia work that has been so incredibly groundbreaking to the field, and has helped me think about new ways to conduct memory work, to conduct care work, to think about cultural production as this thing, as this revolt that we so desperately need as, our world continues to fall apart as multiple settler colonial regimes are committing genocide. So I'm just greatly inspired by all the poets, writers, scholars, and activists out there who are committed to doing this type of transgressive work and who just want to imagine and materialize a brighter future where we can all live more fruitfully and fully. I wanted to share one of my favorite poems from Angela Peña Redondo, and this poem takes us across a Southern California landscape, and it also talks about the contradictions that we as queer, diasporic, non-binary Filipinx subjects hold within us, and also the power and the kinship that can be found in those contradictions as well. So this poem is titled To Hold These Contradictions in Kinship by Angela Peña-Redondo. Forming an arrowhead, ibises carry each other in the direction of what I want to read as a glyph of hope. I walk east. A parking lot almost burns. The dusk blushes lukewarm. Then I'm back again on the balcony of my university building 6.5 years ago before we met, wind transporting brush sediments towards approaching summer. Those jacarandas and tolerant native vines, auspicious walks on hot nights, a feline rolls her body in dirt. Under the sky, I nurse a kindling. You feel gone more than ever. Your shoulder turns over into another bed. Shadows lean into my neck like ink spill, reminding me of those ibises and how I should proceed. In absence, I despise what you've become, what you've always been, a secret set loose, and this body who prays for your reckoning. I just love this poem so much because it talks a lot about how grief is a political process and how grief is something that doesn't really end, but something that takes on different shapes and different landscapes as we move from a parking lot to the balcony of the speaker's university, to watching a cat rolling in dirt, to being under, this beautiful sky, how grief can remind us so much of what we've lost, but also what remains, how much beauty, kinship, or kindling, or fire, or warmth there is still in the world. And to me, that's why grief is a very, very, very powerful affect, a very powerful experience to invite the reader in, because we're not only giving readers the space or the permission to mourn, but we're also giving readers space to discover what else remains, even within a language of grief. Yeah, in terms of scholars, I'm so excited for the future work of Steph Torralba. So Dr. Torralba is an incoming assistant professor of gender, women's, and sexuality studies at Grinnell College. And Dr. Toralba studies contemporary Asian American and Latinx studies, media and cultural studies, and also trans crip of color critique. Dr. Toralba also wrote a very generous review of my poetry collection, What You Refuse to Remember, a review that generated so many questions and thoughts for me about queer death, trans maladjustment, and how queer and trans bodies continue to live on through art, through poetry, and I'm just really excited to see what else Steph is going to produce for us, whether it's in their scholarly writing, creative writing, or in the classes they are going to teach, in the students who are going to be so lucky to have them as a professor. I'm really grateful to have Steph Toralba as a friend and a colleague. I'm also excited for the work of Joy Salas. Joy is another colleague of mine at the CSU. Dr. Salas is at California State University, Los Angeles, and I'm really excited for their future book, which is titled We Are Revolution: Empire, Diaspora, and Transnational Filipino Radicalism. Not only is this book going to be super inspiring for me as someone who also studies activism, other alternative forms of activism and community engagement that MAD and disabled folks partake in, but I'm also really curious to learn more about the history of transnational diasporic Filipinx organizing. And I'm also really excited for the publication of the Beyond the X, Queer and Trans Filipinx Studies anthology, co-edited by Karen Buenavista Hanna and Gina Velasco. I am one of the contributors to this anthology, so is Dr. Toralba, Dr. Sony Corañez Bolton, and so many other scholars in queer and trans Filipinx studies. I'm so grateful to be part of such an amazing cohort of scholars and creatives, and I can't wait to see how this anthology puts us in conversation with each other. And for the creative writers, I'm excited for my dear friend Muriel Leung's novel, How to Fall in Love in a Time of Unnameable Disaster, that's going to be coming out this summer. And, we've been talking a lot about genocide, apocalypses, the world ending. And this novel by Dr. Muriel Leung talks a lot about how love, survival, and kinship still manage to flourish even in a time of unnameable disaster. So I'm so excited to read this novel. And I also wanted to give a shout out to another dear friend and colleague and writer, Kavar, who is currently a PhD candidate at UC Davis. Kavar is a brilliant mad and trans hybrid writer. Their hybrid novel, Failure to Comply, has been released or will be released this summer as well. And Kavar's engagement with madness as method, as a creative writing praxis, has been incredibly inspiring for me as someone who is constantly thinking about hybridity and madness. So I'm just so excited to see what further work Calvar is going to publish and where they're going to be at in the future. So shout out to all these folks and other folks that I haven't mentioned. Thank you all so much for your beautiful work, for your words, and all the transformative energy you're putting out into the world.